Edward I and Edward III are both very strong kings, military kings, martial kings. And Edward II just isn't. He's very weak, so his reign is sort of bookended by his father and son. But to begin with, it wasn't necessarily very, very obvious that Edward II was going to be weak. So he was physically large, like a good Plantagenet, like his father. He was physically big and strong, apparently, quite handsome. His grandfather, Henry III, had like a drooping eye. And Longshanks apparently had a bit of a stammer. And Edward II didn't suffer from any of those things. So apparently he was sort of, good on a horse. And there was nothing sort of physically, obviously, wrong with him or anything. And people, to begin with, when he was a young man, or even during the first few years of his reign, didn't necessarily have a massive problem with him. But it became clear fairly soon into his reign, all the accounts seem to agree, that he was just a bit weird. Like, his actual personality was a bit weird, a bit odd. He may have looked like a king, but he didn't really behave like one. He didn't like war, sort of at all, wasn't interested in it. Didn't really like tournaments and jousting, even though he probably could have done it. Like I say, he was very good on a horse, apparently. But he didn't enjoy the joust, didn't enjoy tournaments. Now, for an early medieval king, that's weird, that's odd. Most people in society will sort of frown on that. We're told that he liked to spend his time doing sort of very unkingly things, like digging ditches or rowing. Kings don't dig ditches or row or thatch roofs. He liked to thatch roofs. And also the company he kept apparently was a bit odd. He didn't really like to spend lots or all of his time, with a few exceptions, which I'll come to, in the company of his nobles and knights. He preferred the company of common people, carriage drivers, jesters, sailors, barge masters, carpenters, diggers. Again, to sort of the nobility or the well-to-do, the baronage, that was just odd to them. A bit more than odd. It was wrong. It was gross to them. So people had question marks over his personality, and it seems that Edward II, being king didn't sit well with him. I think that's fair to say. He was probably quite unhappy in the role. Some kings, some monarchs, some emperors seem to revel in it. They love it. It's like they were born to do it. And others, are very, very uncomfortable. Edward II seems to be one of those people that probably would have lived a happier life not being the king. But then, such is the lot of a hereditary monarch. You don't really get to choose. If it falls to you, you're sort of obliged to do it by duty. But perhaps Edward II could have spent his time, or he would have spent his time doing other things. He wasn't interested in the business of government particularly. He wasn't interested in, the job of balancing books and things. Apparently wasn't particularly interested in, building factions about himself, making his political position safe or anything like that. He liked to sort of fritter away his time with his favourites. So that's one of the first things to mention. One of the biggest takeaway headlines for the rule of Edward II is that he's always accused of having favourites and allowing his time and energy to be dominated by just a very small number of people that he favoured. And again, when you're an early medieval king, you need to sort of be seen to not have massive favourites. I mean, it's okay to have favourites, of course. It's okay to have an inner entourage and things. But when you exclude powerful and rich men, when you do it to the point of excluding extremely powerful people that you need to have on side, well, then it becomes a problem. The first one, the most famous one, is a chap called Piers Gaveston. Any account of the life and reign of Edward II, especially the early part, is inextricably linked with the story of Piers Gaveston. So when Edward II was young, about 16, while he was still only Prince of Wales, while Longshanks was still alive, the son of a Gascon knight was sent by Longshanks, actually, to be part of his entourage, this Piers Gaveston, who was about the same age, I think maybe a year or two older, but about the same age. And it seems that Edward II, over the next few years, fell in love with him. Now, I use that word love because that's what the chroniclers and accounts at the time said. Whether it was sexual, whether they, homosexual partners, is something else. A lot of the chroniclers, a lot of the histories say yes, some say no. Some very good historians say no, there's actually no evidence, contemporary evidence, at the time of that. So before I go forward, I would like just to address that, whether they were or not actually partners, sexual partners. I would say, I don't know, probably yes, but there's a good argument that no. So let me tell you a bit about it. Edward II himself, in a letter, called Gaveston our dear and faithful brother. So that's one of the first things to mention. Nowadays, in the 21st century, it seems that men can't be extremely close friends without being accused of being gay. Now, it is not the case. You can have extremely close friendships between men, which aren't homosexual. And anyway, in the pre-modern age, certainly in the medieval period or the ancient world, that was even more the case, I think. You can certainly have a bond, a deep bond with another man, which isn't gay. And it may be that Edward and Gaveston, it was the case. Calling him brother, that some historians have said, no, it wasn't gay, it was just such a close bond that Edward sort of basically adopted him as a brother. I don't know. I really don't know. Again, if I had to put money on it, I'd probably say there was something there. But in the 1320s, one chronicler described it as an indissoluble love. Now, again, love, especially in the early Middle Ages and the Middle Ages, doesn't necessarily mean anything sexual. They quite often use the word love just to mean, a platonic love, nothing sexual about it. However, it is still a loaded word, even back then. Also, a covenant of constancy. Now it is getting into a grey area, right? I mean, constancy, again, there's nothing explicit there, but it's an interesting use of words. And we're told, again, a chronicler from the early 14th century said that their friendship was fastened with a knot. So here's the bottom line on it. There is no explicit evidence, contemporary evidence, that says they were gay or sodomy. And let's be clear, in the early 14th century, sodomy was a very, very bad crime. It was heresy. Your soul would be damned for it. So it's not just like today, or even at other times in history, in the 18th, 19th century, it might have still been illegal, but mostly it was sort of okay. People might raise eyebrows at someone like Oscar Wilde or something, but nobody really cares. You're not going to be excommunicated and shunned massively, particularly. Well, anyway, in the 14th century, it was pretty bad crime. So then you can make the argument that anyone that was going to mention it would couch it in ambiguous language. But certainly Edward Longshanks, and Edward II's father-in-law never expressed any concerns that he thought Edward II was a sodomite. In the 1330s, so after the death of Edward II, the Bishop of Winchester, Adam Orleton, did describe Edward as a sodomite. Now, this is what history is all about, the study of history. This was after his death now. So then, again, there may have been political reasons, or he may have been able to speak more freely after Edward had died. Does that mean that his account of saying that you can give more credence to it or less credence to it? Was it in the interests of people after Edward II had died to darken his name, darken his character? You could make arguments both ways. The fact that it was explicitly said relatively soon after his death, you know, for me, if you're going to balance it out, would lend itself to maybe there was a gay relationship there. But one great historian has said that, or more than one historian has said, modern historian, that the nature of the royal court in England in the early 14th century, 13th, 14th century, there was sort of no privacy, that it would have been impossible to conduct any sort of illicit, you know, dangerous liaisons. Yeah, I mean, quite possibly. That rings true to me. That's one of the big reasons in my mind that would weigh it the other way, that there probably wasn't a gay relationship because of exactly that. How could they have kept it secret? Apparently, kings and queens, quite often, essentially had no privacy. They were sort of never left alone. There would be people literally in their bedroom while they slept. That's what they say about Queen Elizabeth I, hundreds of years after this. There's always questions over whether or not she was a virgin. She claimed to be a virgin until the day she died, the Virgin Queen. People said no, she had sexual relationships with all sorts of people. And some historians say that's just not possible. There were ladies in waiting in her room 24/7. She was never alone, literally never alone. So some say that about Edward and Piers Gaveston. But nevertheless, in the 1390s, another chronicler said that he was too much given to the vice of sodomy. So it is explicitly said there. But again, bear in mind, this is quite a long time after the 1390s by that point. And perhaps they're just taking the account of Adam Ollerton. Apparently, one last thing to say about Adam Ollerton, the Bishop of Winchester's account, is that later, but during his own lifetime, someone said, wait, didn't you accuse the late king of being a sodomite? You explicitly said that. And he backpedaled, apparently backpedaled. He says, no, I was talking about somebody else. I was talking about Hugh Despenser. It wasn't Edward. So anyway, there's a grey area. A lot of historians, most historians do say that they were in a gay relationship. But there is, I would probably, I suppose, again, if I had to put money on it, agree with that. But there is a strong argument that they weren't. It is totally possible that they weren't.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.